And now we've started the recording. So far, so good. And I'm going to try and share this screen. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, welcome everybody to another one of the San Luis Obispo Railroad Museum's parlor car chats. There on the screen you should see the home page of the museum if you're not familiar with that, SLORRM.com. And just so everybody's aware that these chats are a program of the museum. Today's topic is the Swanton Pacific Railroad with Charlie Crabb. So without further ado, I'm going to try and pass this over to him. Let me find him on the list here. There we go. And just hang on here a second, folks. We'll get this going. Charlie, do you have your invitation?
I do.
There you go.
My screen now, is that correct?
Oh yes, I see an Eskimo pie in a car.
No, you should see my PowerPoint.
Well, we have the wrong window selected then, maybe.
It's the only window I have, so we're not getting it.
We're getting an Eskimo pie with a yellow car.
That's my home screen. Hold on, let me see if we can. Okay, let's go back out. Oh, okay, I know what I've done wrong here. Hold on, we gotta.
Ooh, we're getting closer. We have a PowerPoint frame now.
Okay, how are we doing now?
That looks good.
Perfect. Sorry for that, folks. First off, just like to welcome everybody. Happy 2021. And also, I'd like to just thank everybody for their interest in the San Luis Obispo Railroad Museum and in the Swanton Pacific Railroad. I'm involved with both organizations, and you know, we've struggled to manage through a lot of things, particularly the COVID-19 impacts and stuff. And so, your support of the museum and the railroad is greatly appreciated. So let me condition this talk with the fact that I am not the expert on the Swanton Pacific Railroad. I do have a good understanding of it. I do I've worked with Al Smith in the past, so I have a pretty good idea what he was hoping for. But there are people who have a lot more experience and a lot more detail. But hopefully today I can give you an overview of the over 105-year history of what Swanton Pacific Railroad holds. So let's start off with the Pan-Pacific International Exhibition. This was in 1915. It occurred in San Francisco, obviously. It was to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal, but also to celebrate the rebuilding of San Francisco. So in 1906, San Francisco was substantially destroyed by earthquake and fire. And so by 1915, they were ready to kind of show off the fact that they were back. And with the Panama Canal opening, the West Coast ports were trying to position themselves to be the center for commerce for shipping on the West Coast. And so It was quite an affair. It was built out in the what is now the Marina District of San Francisco. It was interesting. It was constructed from temporary materials. It was not intended to be a permanent facility. There's only a few structures, a couple structures that still exist. The Palace of Fine Arts is one of them, but it was rebuilt essentially to make it a more permanent facility. So as part of the Pan-Pacific International Exhibition, there was something called the Overfair Railroad. And let me just play this YouTube video for you really quick here. This is, we're just going to play.
We're not seeing the video part of it. We can hear it.
It's on my screen. Can we see it now?
No, now we're back to the slide.
Okay. All right. It has something to do with okay. Again, just the music, or do you see the image?
Just the music right now.
All right, we're going to skip this part. Let's go back to the slides. So that video was, if you go to that YouTube link that I have on the screen, that video shows the Overfair Railroad and the locomotives that were involved. So the Overfair Railroad, or railway, was the vision of a gentleman named Lewis McDermot. McDermot was from a wealthy Oakland family, and he was kind of an entrepreneur and engineering buff, and he successfully acquired the transportation, one of the transportation concessions for the Pan-Pacific International Exhibition. So his idea was to build a 1/3 scale steam-driven railroad that would carry the people around the fairgrounds to be able to get to the various events. The fair site was 635 acres, so there was a lot of ground to cover. So McDermott decided to build 1/3 scale 462 Pacific type locomotive. Now he chose those because they were kind of the state-of-the-art steam locomotive at the time. And so he ended up building 4 of the Pacifics, and then he also built a switcher locomotive that he used as in the construction, and in some cases used as part of the transportation. If you want a more detailed sort of description of the Overfair Railroad, the San Francisco Museum has a very good article about the Overfair Railroad and how it was developed. So basically, McDermott set out in some shops in Oakland to build these locomotives, and he did a very good job. They're very much to scale, with some few exceptions like the steam-driven air compressors and some other things that he adapted off of full-size railroads. Let's stay with this. So he was able to complete 3 of the 4 Pacific type locomotives, the 462s. A 4th one was nearly completed, but had never had fire put in the boiler. The other 3 were used actively at the fair along with that switcher locomotive. As I said, the fair ran for about 9 months. I think McDermott had hoped it was going to go longer. It didn't. He ended up losing a tremendous amount of money in this. It's family money that he lost because they just, the ridership was not what they expected. and then the length of the time of the fair and the cost of building the locomotives and building out the railroad there on the fair grounds. So after the fair was over, the locomotives and the rail cars were all returned to Oakland, and they languished on the property in Oakland. The locomotives were actually cared for pretty well, but the rail cars, all the passenger cars, were just stored outside, and weather took a really heavy toll on those. There was some hope that McDermott would be able to bring the locomotives and the railroad, the passenger cars, to the World's Fair that happened on Treasure Island. That didn't become reality. However, in 1940, McDermott struck a deal with the then Oakland Zoo, what's now Nolan Park, to run the railroad there. They actually called it the Mountain Lion Railroad. But apparently by this time, McDermott was getting a little eccentric, a little cranky, I guess, and the zoo eventually invited him out. So the equipment was taken down, the railroad was dismantled. In the meantime, in 1943, Billy Jones was able to acquire the passenger cars. And these were in a fairly, and let me back up a second. Billy Jones was a former Southern Pacific engineer who had started to build out essentially about a 1/3 scale railroad in the San Jose area. It still exists, and you can still go ride the Billy Jones Wildcat Railroad. So Billy Jones bought up some of the cars, the passenger cars. And then in 1948, he acquired the locomotives from the McDermott estate after Lewis McDermott passed away. And so those locomotives were stored in the East Bay in the San Jose area under Billy Jones' care. But they were not brought back into service, as I understand it. And then they started getting some attention later. So in 1960, the 1914, the 1915, and the 1500, which was that little switcher engine, they were sold to some folks down in Southern California. And in 1975, the 1912 and 1913 were used up in the Calistoga area to create a steam railroad associated with a vineyard in Calistoga. So actually the 1913 went back into service and was operated at that site. The railroad only lasted a couple of years. It was not a great location, so there wasn't very much, there wasn't enough visitors to make it really pay off. And so it wasn't long before the railroad there at Calistoga was decommissioned. It was in 1979 that Al Smith learned of the locomotives and purchased the 1912 and the 1913 from the folks up at Calistoga. And then once he got a hold of those, he started, sort of looking around for the rest of them. And in 1983, he was able to purchase the 1914 and the 1915. And so that was the beginning, in 1979, was the beginning of the Swanton Pacific Railroad. So before we talk too much about the Swanton Pacific Railroad, we ought to talk a little bit about Al Smith. So Al Smith grew up in the East Bay in the San Jose area. His father was a farmer, orchardist. They had orchards that the Southern Pacific tracks ran through. So as he grew up, he was surrounded by these huge steam locomotives and just completely captivated by those trains. As he got older and decided it was time to go to college, he actually went to Cal Poly And he told me one time the reason he came to Cal Poly was that he found out that the campus had a train that ran through campus. And that's true. The Southern Pacific runs through the Cal Poly campus on its way into San Luis Obispo. And he claims that's why he decided to go to Cal Poly. So he was a crop science student at Cal Poly. And then at the beginning of World War II, Al went to work for the Southern Pacific Railroad. So he left Cal Poly, went to work for the Southern Pacific Railroad. And, you know, my guess is he probably would have stayed with the railroad, except he was involved in an accident. My understanding is he was blown off of a freight car by a blast of steam, and he ended up losing part of his leg. And so he was basically was not able to continue with the Southern Pacific. They provided some kind of compensation for the accident, and he actually went back to Cal Poly, finished his degree, and got his teaching credential, and started teaching agriculture, initially over in the San Joaquin Valley, but eventually he got back to the East Bay of and was teaching agriculture. In addition to running the orchard, his father was also the general manager of a small grower co-op that was set up for all of the growers in the East Bay to be able to get, you know, supplies and materials at reduced cost because of the size of the buying power of the co-op. And when Al Smith's father passed away, the board approached Al Smith about taking over as the general manager of this grower co-op. So Al was one of those guys that just, you know, could see things a little more clearly, perhaps, than everybody, than some of us. And he realized at the time that San Jose and the Bay Area didn't need a grower cooperative. They needed some kind of a hardware store to basically meet the needs of all these new homeowners and all these neighborhoods, these residential neighborhoods that were going in up and down the bay. So he eventually was able to shift the focus of this small grower co-op and turned it into Orchard Supply Hardware. And he obviously did very well with that, and that was in large part where the funds came from that allowed him to be able to do what he's done with the ranch and the railroad. Now, I told you that when he had his accident with the Southern Pacific, there was a settlement. And with that settlement, Al Smith bought some property near Davenport along Swanton Road. And the significance of this property to Al Smith was it was originally a Boy Scout camp that he had attended when he was a young boy. And I remember sitting and talking to Al, looking at some old pictures of some of the old trestles that were built when that area was clear-cut after the 1906 earthquake. So that whole area along 101 north of Santa Cruz was clear-cut to rebuild San Francisco. And they built these wooden trestles in the canyons to be able to bring the lumber out from these the higher elevations. And he talks about going up these canyons when he was a Boy Scout. And a group of them would go out and get on these old trestles. And by this time, the trestles were pretty rickety. And then they would start to rock back and forth on the trestle. And the deal was the last guy standing was the bravest, right? Everybody else would eventually panic and go down and just sort of grab on and hold on and hope the trestle didn't collapse. And he, you know, he had some pictures of these old trestles, and I could just imagine this group of kids out there on these trestles doing this kind of stuff. So that was the beginning of Swanton Pacific Ranch, was that initial purchase. And over time, Al Smith accumulated neighboring properties and ended up with 3,200 acres, 3,200 acres. They literally went from the coastline. They had almost 6 miles of coastal frontage. Went from the coast up into basically old growth redwood at the top of the ridge. And absolutely beautiful piece of property that he eventually gathered together. So, as I said, in 1979, he decided to start putting together the Swanton Pacific Railroad. And so it's interesting. The logo is basically a Southern Pacific logo with the S laid on its side. So it's the lazy SP is the term he used to describe his railroad. And Al Smith, along with a group of mostly railroad retirees, began to build out this railroad. And they started operating these steam locomotives, so the 1912, the 1913, and 1914. I told you the 1915 had been finished for the, almost finished, but it was never, there was never a fire in the boiler. And so it was in his roundhouse basically apart. And he made the decision to donate that in 1915 to the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. And so until recently, if you went into the Railroad Museum in the lobby, the 1915 was on display there. And it was beautifully restored, but it's never been operated. So it's never been a working steam locomotive. My understanding is they're doing a remodel on the Railroad Museum, and the 1915 has been moved out of that area while the remodel takes place. And I'm not exactly sure how they plan to put that back together. So back to Al Smith. In the late 1980s, Al approached Cal Poly with the idea of donating the Swanton Pacific Ranch to Cal Poly. And at that time, I was working as the interim associate dean in the College of Agriculture at Cal Poly, and was tasked to work with Al to help facilitate the process for us to explore the idea of taking over the ranch. So Al's idea was that the ranch would be a working laboratory where students of agriculture, whether it would be students that are studying natural resources, animal science, crop science, soil science, you name it, would have a working laboratory that they could come and deepen their education. The idea was that it was to be kept as a single piece, the property was to be kept as a single piece of property. It wasn't to be split up and sold off. And so we were able to work through that process. Now, in those early days, in the late 80s, when we were working with Al Smith, his plan was different for a railroad. His plan was to create a separate railroad organization, a 501c3, that would basically take over the operation of the Swanton Pacific Railroad. As time progressed, he became concerned that the people that would be the likely suspects to be part of this organization that was going to be created for the railroad were aging out and passing away, and he was concerned about the sustainability of his plan. And so he came back to Cal Poly and basically asked that the railroad be folded into the land gift. And so it was in 1993, I believe, that the gift was actually made, where the ranch, the 3,200 acres, and the railroad were gifted to Cal Poly. And at that time, the College of Agriculture, what's now the College of Agriculture, Food, and Environmental Sciences, was charged with operating the ranch and operating the railroad. Now, you kind of scratch your head and say, College of Agriculture operating a railroad doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, the good news is there was a core of people that created what has been termed as the Swanton Pacific Railroad Society. We'll talk about them in a minute, but they're the ones that really have kept the train going. So let's talk a little bit about what equipment that Al Smith accumulated before he made the gift. So there's more than a mile of track. The track follows the Scotts Creek drainage, or Scotts Creek, down from what used to be the town of Swanton, and then heads down toward the ocean. And this is the right-of-way is crosses the creek and then parallels the creek as it goes down to an open meadow at the end. So at the end of the mile or so of track, Al built a Y to be able to turn the locomotives around. And at the top end, there's a turntable that was basically purchased from the folks up at Calistoga where it was originally put into service. So again, I mentioned that Al was able to get the 4 steam locomotives. So there's 3 of the Pacific locomotives, and the 4th steam locomotive is the 1500, the switcher. When I talk about a switcher, that 1500, instead of towing a tender, has saddle tanks. And so on one side, those locomotives were originally designed to run on coal, so one side is a coal hopper and the other side is a water tank. Those locomotives have been converted to run on oil, so since the Calistoga days, they've been oil-fired steam locomotives. So the 1500 hasn't run in a very long time. It's apart and needs to be restored. The other locomotive that Al Smith acquired was a 1/3 scale GE U-25 diesel switcher locomotive, and that one is used for sort of day-to-day track maintenance, moving cars around, that sort of thing. We also had a small motor car. Randy Jones is a key player in that. That was a car that he helped build, or he built, and we used that to again move things around, particularly around the railroad yard. Over time, Al had acquired about 9 passenger cars. There was only one of the original overfare passenger cars that still existed, and that one had just recently been restored, but had yet to be used. The railroad also has a number of maintenance away cars. Some of those were actually built at Cal Poly. There's a really cool crane that we have, a crane car with a motorized crane that we can take up and down the track. There's hopper cars, flatbed maintenance cars, so crew cars, other things that are used to maintain the tracks and the railroad facilities. More recently, the students at Cal Poly built what we call our heavy haul car, and it's a rail car that's designed to come apart with hydraulics to let you lower the deck down so you can drive a piece of equipment up onto the deck, use the hydraulics to lift that deck up, bring your truck back under it, put it down, now you can roll it down the track. There's areas in the railroad that are essentially not accessible other than by the railroad. And so we had to have a way to haul equipment down if we needed to do some construction work or other things. And so that was a completely student project, a beautiful car, a good outcome for that effort. And so Cal Poly has made an effort to engage students in the railroad. We've had a number of student-related railroad projects. We have a track sweeper device that was built by students. More recently, the students did some stuff with using computerized and GPS technology to be able to monitor where locomotives, where trains are along the track. We also had the students build a really nice track gauge sensor where we could roll that down the track and it measures the gauge, but it also puts pressure on the track to see if the ties are holding the tracks the way they should. And it's all done electronically with the data loggers, so we can look foot by foot and see what the condition of the track is. So in terms of being able to ensure track safety, that was a huge advantage to us. So the facilities that Al Smith put together were allowed us to basically operate and maintain the railroad. So you had the roundhouse. So on this slide on your computer screen, it's in the upper left-hand corner, is the roundhouse where we'd store the locomotives. Upper right is the car shop and the car barn that's sort of tucked in behind it. So that's where we were able to roll cars in and out to do maintenance. And the picture at the bottom is our machine shop. Now it's kind of interesting, the machine shop is actually the old cafeteria from the Boy Scout camp. So when Al Smith was a young boy coming up to the Boy Scout camp, this is where they would come to get their food when they were at the Boy Scout camp. And if you go to the back wall, the outside back wall of this building, you can see where the Boy Scout kids wrote their names and drew little pictures and sort of an early form of graffiti, right, from the Boy Scouts, as they waited in line to go through the cafeteria for their meals. And so the building has quite a bit of history. It's kind of cramped, but the volunteers have done a good job equipping the machine shop and are able to do most of our own repairs with the equipment we have in place. Also, the railroad has an open-air train station, and it has 4 standard gauge cabooses that were acquired over a period of time. One of the cabooses is actually Al Smith's office from his days at Orchard Supply Hardware, and it's labeled, it has the Orchard Supply, the OSH symbol on the side, and he had used it as an office, and so there's some history there. The other cabooses are essentially Southern Pacific cabooses that have been acquired over time. So the operations of the Swanton Pacific Railroad is pretty limited, actually, because the railroad's not it's not permitted to operate like a public venue in a sense. So it's operated primarily by the Swanton Pacific Railroad Society. We typically have 3 or 4 public events a year. So those that are familiar with it would recognize that we had what was called Al Smith Day. That's usually in the spring around Al Smith's birthday. And, you know, we would attract, well, we could attract as many people as we wanted. We typically capped the attendance of those events to 500 people because it just became difficult to find parking spaces and to be able to manage that many people to make sure everybody kind of went away happy having rides. So the society basically would prepare for and operate the locomotives on those events. We'd also have what was called Cal Poly Day. Al Smith created a tradition of on New Year's Eve taking the last train out and the first train in. So just before midnight, you would ride the train out of the station, go down to the end of the track, they'd turn around, and just after midnight, you'd roll back into the station. And they would have a New Year's celebration kind of centered around the train. The volunteers are able to keep the railroad going through the use of what we call work weekends. And during the winter, it's one weekend a month. It's always associated with the second Saturday of the month. So whenever the second Saturday is, that weekend is the work weekend. In the late spring through the summer into early fall, they go to 2 weekends a month, the second and fourth Saturdays. And then usually in July or August, they will have a work week. They call it summer camp. And so volunteers will come and pretty much most of them stay there on site, and they work on major projects for the entire week. And it gives them plenty of time, and usually that culminates in running the steam locomotives. And in some cases, the last weekend or last Sunday of the summer camp was an open house that was primarily targeted to the volunteers, their families and friends, and it's sort of a thanks, to everybody for letting the volunteers do what they do and come ride the train. And so there was a little bit of a dark history as part of this with the locomotives. Some of the neighbors didn't think as highly of the locomotives as Al Smith did, and so there were some battles, some culminating in some legal action, and so the county has been very clear that railroad operations will be limited, and so we have to kind of pay attention to those that decree from the county. And so the idea that we'd open this railroad up any time is just not in the cards. It's we have an agreement that limits the use of the railroad. But we welcome visitors, especially on the work weekends. We tell people, come on by. Somebody will show you around, let you get up close to the locomotives. Occasionally, if you're visiting on the right day or right time, you might actually get a ride on one of the work cars or something like that. But the railroad is open to the public informally most of the year, and then with just a handful of formal public activities at other times. So again, I mentioned this group several times already, but the Pacific Coast Railroad Society is really the reason the railroad continues to exist. Without this group, I don't think the university would have been able to maintain the railroad, to be able to do the things that have been done with the railroad. And so any given work weekend, summer camp, there's always projects to be done. And the pictures to the left of your screen show all the different things going on. And I don't care what your skill set is, there's something for you to do. I mean, if all you can do is move a paintbrush, then that's your job. That can be your job. If you're an equipment operator, then okay, maybe you can operate the shovel and help us clear right away or do other things. If you're a pipe fitter, man, we've got a lot of pipe fitting to do on these steam locomotives. You want to learn how to lay track? Come on out. Laying track and replacing ties all the time. And so it's there's more to be done than there are people or time to do it for the most part. But the university and the College of Agriculture owe a great gratitude to the Swanton Pacific Railroad Society for all they do to operate, to maintain and operate these locomotives. Just as a sidebar, in this picture to the left, the one on the bottom, that's actually the 1913 with the new boiler fitted to it. So these boilers on the steam locomotives were built in the, obviously the early 1900s. They were all hand riveted. They were all built by hand with, machine tools that don't, that we think are almost prehistoric today. And so, as those locomotives aged, one of the things that became a concern is what kind of pressure can they take. And so the decision was made in the case of the 1913 to go ahead and abandon the old boiler and have a new boiler built. So instead of being hand riveted, these new boilers, of course, are all welded. The advantage is we get a certified boiler. The old hand-built boilers could not be certified because they were built before the certification process existed. So the only way we could get them certified today is we'd have to dismantle the locomotive and then have an engineer come in and do X-ray and ultrasound work to determine the thickness of the metal and integrity of the rivets and come up with a engineering estimate on what the appropriate pressure rating would be. So we've decided in the case of 2 locomotives that we would just go ahead and get new boilers that are certified and sort of, because the cost isn't much different. And we could go try to certify the old boilers and find out, spend a lot of money and find out that we can't certify them. So our decision was to go ahead with replacing the boilers. So as I said, the society benefits from a lot of hard-working volunteers, and the society offers a lot of opportunities for anybody that wanted to get involved with things that are railroad related. Now all this kind of came to a screeching end, or at least to a hard pause, on August 16th when the CZU Complex fire in Santa Cruz County came down off of the mountain through the canyons and through the railroad yard. And when the fire subsided, we found the roundhouse, which this is the roundhouse with the locomotives inside, was completely destroyed. The car shop was destroyed. The car barn was destroyed. The turntable we used that's in front of the roundhouse was damaged, not significantly. It's been repaired. The machine shop, amazingly, sitting all in the sort of right in the same complex, was almost completely unaffected. There were some plastic window panes that show signs of heat damage, but for the most part, they were unaffected. Our 4 cabooses, the train station, and with some minor exceptions, the track was not damaged. So, but the devastation, as you can see from this picture, the heat of the fires were substantial. For example, if you look at the picture of the locomotive that's sitting there, you see where the toolbox is, and on top of the boiler, just to the right of the toolbox, there's a bracket sitting there. That bracket used to have the bell. So there was a brass bell on there, and the bell's gone. There's no evidence the bell existed. So that fire was hot enough to melt the bell. It melted the whistles. It was a very, very hot fire. So the devastation was just, mind-boggling, and it's just heartbreaking to see the kind of damage that's taken place. Now, there were a couple of bright spots. The 502 was actually in the machine shop, and as I mentioned, the machine shop was spared from the fire. So the 502 had been in for maintenance and some restoration work, and so with the exception of the hoods that go over the back of where the engine and other things are, the 502 can be brought back into service without too great of effort. The 1912, which is the steam locomotive that's stripped down, you see in the picture in the center top, that locomotive's in Wyoming having a new boiler fitted on it. Now, as the director of the railroad, I've been kind of hounding the company in Wyoming to finish the 1912. It's well overdue to be returned to the railroad. Had they met my requested deadlines, we would have lost that locomotive too. So because they have been slow to get this locomotive, or the new boiler put on this locomotive, we essentially have saved this locomotive. So they will hopefully have this locomotive completed and back on site by this summer. The train station, the bottom center photograph, untouched by the fire. The fire raged just above this area and around it, but for whatever reason never went through the meadow itself where the train station is. And as I said earlier, most of the track is serviceable. There are some areas where the ties were caught on fire and burned out from under the rails, but we'll be able to get back in and repair those without too much effort. So what's the future hold? People are asking that question a lot. What do the future hold for these for the Swanton Pacific Railroad? And so our first step is to recover the locomotives. And we've sort of had, we've covered the area. We've put a tent over the area to keep the weather from deteriorating the locomotives further. We've been told, we've been advised not to roll the locomotives with that kind of fire, with that kind of heat, that the kind of damage that occurs to the bearings, if we roll them, we can cause further damage. And so what we've done is we're going to go in starting actually on Monday and recover as many of the parts that were off of the locomotives as we can. And then the cleanup crews will come in and clean up all the fire-related debris. And after that, we'll be able to come in with and lift the locomotives and put them onto skids. So we won't roll them. We'll lift them, put them onto skids, and then slide the skids into storage containers and basically secure the locomotives until at such time we can start to work on restoration again. We're told that, of course, we'll have to have the boilers re-inspected. On the 1913, even though we'd only fired it once at a low pressure, we're going to have to basically take that locomotive apart again, have the boiler retested, and then recertified and put back into service. The motor car was in the barn as well, in the roundhouse. It's substantially destroyed. Whether we can salvage the frame and some other things, we'll look and see. But that, as I say, that work begins right away. The 502, we need to finish the work that we started on the 502. We need to get a tender restored that will then be used for the 1912 when it's returned from Wyoming. And so we'll assess the condition of the 3 tenders that were in the roundhouse and take one of those and rebuild it to be ready for the 1912. As I said, we'll have to rebuild the motor car. We'll have to build passenger cars. All of our passenger cars are destroyed. When the fire went through the car barn, it was hot enough that basically, and those cars are substantially wood, and so they're gone. We'll be able to recover the frames, the trucks, some of the other things, but essentially we're starting from scratch when it comes to rail cars. The other question we're going to have to ask is whether or not, since essentially we have to rebuild the entire railroad anyway in terms of the buildings, whether or not the current location is the best location. It kind of makes sense to stay there because of some of the infrastructure, but at the same time, we could move the railroad down toward the ranch headquarters, move it away from the creek, because the creek does present a risk to our right-of-way. We've had problems with washouts from the creek in the past. And so going in and looking at possible locations to resite the railroad is a possibility in the process. But the expectation is that, well, starting this month, hopefully, the university will begin a visioning process for the ranch and for the railroad. And it's happening for the ranch as well because the ranch really was shoehorned into what the existing facilities are. Since everything on the ranch was destroyed except for the ranch headquarters building, we really have a chance to redefine the facilities at the ranch as well as the railroad. So hopefully there will be an integrated vision of how the ranch and railroad will be rebuilt, and that'll come out in the next few months. But in the meantime, you know, we're going to keep moving ahead with the 502, with the restoration of the timber, and to, you know, get the track ready to at least have some limited use of the locomotives in the near term. So those of you interested in more information about this, there's a variety of sites you can go to. There's a good Wikipedia page on the Pan Pacific International Exhibition. The San Francisco Museum has good information about not only the exhibition, but also the Overfair Railroad. Of course, we have a Swanton Pacific page on Wikipedia. There's also Facebook pages, and Cal Poly has a website or homepage for the railroad itself. These links, don't worry about writing them down. These links will be available on the museum site, and if you watch this again later, you'll see that. But Jamie, I think that pretty much covers it, but I would like to open it up for questions. I'm assuming there will be some. Just as you get that, you work through that process, picture top left is, of course, controls on, I think that's probably the 1914. And then, of course, the two steam locomotives and our 502. And those of you that knew Al Smith, he had an interesting humor. And if you do a little homework, 502 is police code for driving under the influence. So there was always some meaning in some of the stuff that Al had, you know, like the lazy SP and those sorts of things. There's always a backstory to them. But hopefully we're able to continue to rebuild or get back to rebuilding the railroad, and hopefully these locomotives will be preserved well into the history, and that generations to come will be able to benefit from Al Smith's vision of preserving these artifacts of the steam locomotive era. So, questions, Jamie?
Okay, let me. I'll get the everybody turned on here in a second. In the meantime, while I'm doing that, Gary asked a question: Is Al Smith still alive, and is he involved at all? If so.
No, Al Smith passed away a number of years ago, a couple of decades ago, I guess. Yeah, so he's not involved in it, obviously.
Okay. If you want to turn your mics on, most of them should be on, or can be on if you turn them on. And feel free to ask a question. And when we sort of finish the questions, I'll put up one last slide at my end, and that'll wrap it up. Are there any questions?
I got a question.
Go ahead.
With the museum as part of the visioning, is the society going to be part of that visioning workshop? I'm assuming they're going to have a workshop with not only the staff, with the school staff and the ranch staff, but is the society going to be part of that so the society can help? If the vision is to relocate the railroad, to help, that you're going to essentially have railroad the railroad group itself being part of that group, that hopefully that way they feel that they're going to be part of that decision making to an extent, or at least part of that vision creation?
So the visioning exercise, since the ranch and railroad are property of the university, the corporation, and the College of Agriculture, Food, and Environmental Sciences is the lead, the dean is the one that is driving this process. My understanding is his intent is to cast a wide net for stakeholders. So the answer is yes. The Railroad Society is a key group of stakeholders that need to be involved in this process. They're the ones that really understand the operation of this railroad, and they have on-the-ground experience with the ranch and the railroad, and so they're going to be an integral part of that discussion. The answer is yes. I'm not going to be directly involved in that. My deal with Andy, with Dean Thulin, is I had actually retired, and last July, or a year ago, was it a year ago? No, yeah. And after the fire, I was asked to come back and just help, because there are so many moving pieces to the recovery work associated with the fire that the crew, or the group that were doing the railroad at Swanton Pacific at the time on his behalf, were overloaded. So my deal with Dean Thulin is I'll get it back to we'll secure the railroad facilities. We will, he will start a planning process, and I'll slip back out into a quiet retirement. My plan. We'll see about it.
And any other questions?
I don't necessarily have a question, but I do have a memory. Charlie mentioned that Al had a funny sense of humor, and then people asked about, was he involved in the ranch? And up until he passed away, if I'm not mistaken, he lived at the ranch, and he was very involved at the ranch. He was very involved with the students that were studying at the ranch. And I'm retired from Cal Poly also, and I remember talking with some students one time that had been at the ranch and asking them, what it was like and stuff, and they said it was a lot of fun. And they said, on any given day, a group of students would be gathering their cars, and they were getting ready to drive down into Santa Cruz because they were going to go get pizza. And Al would walk by and see him and say, "Oh, what are you guys doing?" And they'd say, "Oh, we're going for pizza. You want to join us?" And about half the time he'd say yes, and they always loved that because they knew that if he jumped in the car with them, that meant he was buying the beer and pizza that day.
There are great stories about Al Smith.
And the other half of the time they'd say, "Well, you want to join us?" And he'd say, "Well, I'm just a senior citizen on a fixed income. I don't think I can afford to go with you today."
Yeah. Well, his fixed income was different than the fixed income most of us experience. But
exactly.
But yes, he continued until he was not able to. Continued to be involved with the ranch and the railroad, and so he was definitely a fixture. He maintained a house on the ranch, but he also maintained a house in I think it was in Campbell, where his last house was. Just an exceptional guy. You would never know that he's very humble. You'd never know that he had the kind of resources that he had. You'd see him at the railroad events with his, kind of dirty bib overalls on, and he was. I consider it an honor to have been able to work with him even a little bit on the transition of the ranch, and he was an exceptional guy, and he loved the students, and that was his whole motivating factor. He had his greatest concern when we started talking about the ranch was that the ranch was too far away from Cal Poly, and that it wasn't going to work, and that that if it wasn't going to have an impact on students, he would look at some other plan for the ranch. And so for a long time, we leased the ranch for like $1 a year or something, and to sort of test the concept, do a proof of concept. And he was really pleased at how all that worked out.
Any other questions?
Quick question: How did the rest of the ranch fare in the fire? I presume a lot of it got burned, but I presume there was a lot of other activities at the ranch besides the railroad. And generally speaking, how badly were they destroyed, and what's the future of the whole ranch in general?
So every building on the ranch, with the exception of what we call the greenhouse, which is the headquarters building as you come onto the ranch property, and the long barn that's behind it, which is historically significant. That long barn was built at the turn of the 20th century. It's a really cool old barn. The construction techniques that were used looked like it was built by folks that built ships. And that area was spared from the fire, but most of the rest of the ranch, all the infrastructure is gone. So, all the electrical distribution, we had internet, we had cabling, fiber optics, things like that, all gone. All the buildings are gone. So there's no more residents. There's only a small barracks, an apartment at the headquarters. So all of our capacity to house people on the ranch, when I'd go up there, I'd stay in something called the Little Creek House. It was burned to the ground. The railroad volunteers would stay in the Red House. It was burned to the ground. Al's house, the education center at Al's house was lost. Staub house, the yurts the students would live in. So we don't have any way to support the staff or students. All the staff housing was destroyed. So right now the focus is on restoring staff housing, and then we'll start working on student housing. As I said, there was plans for a major educational center. Those plans are in hand, and depending on the visioning exercise, we might go ahead and get started on those facilities sooner than later. But other than sort of the ranch headquarters, everything is gone. We also lost a lot of culverts and other things. Some of the culverts are made out of corrugated plastic, so the fire would catch that stuff on fire, and so those culverts are gone. So we, depending on how heavy the rains are this winter, we could see some washouts if we don't get around to getting all those culverts. Some people have asked about insurance. The buildings were insured. The stuff in the buildings was not insured. So none of the railroad cars, locomotives, anything else was insured. So we will get insurance money to rebuild buildings, but not say rebuild locomotives. So and Al Smith's endowment was very generous for the operation of the railroad, but it's not adequate for the rebuilding of the railroad. But again, we have those bright spots I talked about earlier. We have a locomotive in Wyoming that's coming back as a complete, should be a complete functioning steam locomotive, and we have the 502. That's a really good place to start from.
How about natural resources on the branch? Like you talked about logging and stuff in the early days. Was that all destroyed?
Yeah, timber's gone. What we really worry about right now, and this could impact the railroad, but it would impact other areas of the ranch. If they get heavy rains, then you'll have debris flows, and you'll have further damage of the property, the roads, and potentially of the railroad yard. A number of years ago, they had a debris flow that plugged up the undercroft on Swanton Road, and it flooded up through railroad yard facilities. And so that's certainly a possibility. We're hoping that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, also, doesn't, with the fire now, I mean, it's sad, but it also gives the students an opportunity now. They'll be researching how habitat recovers after a major fire like this. So the educational opportunities just shift and change a little bit. they still exist, though, for the students and for the university.
Yeah, we already have faculty and students working on establishing baselines on the resource base, and then looking at how that comes back. So yeah, absolutely. And if you drive up there, it's interesting. You drive up there right after a fire, it's just like there's not anything green anywhere. And now you drive up there and you see trees resprouting and plants coming back to life and wildflowers popping up, and so it's amazing how quickly it recovers. But you're right, Bob, there's a whole new set of opportunities for our instructional program. Most of the farmland is leased out, wasn't affected. The apple orchard survived. Some other things that we run. It was funny. We had a free-range chicken operation going on that was there by the apple orchard, and what they did was, when it looked like there was a potential for the fire to come down through the valley, they turned on all the sprinklers in the apple orchard to get it as wet as they could, and they herded all the chickens into the apple orchard. Well, after the fire passed, they went up there. All the chickens were still in the apple orchard, and the apple orchard pretty much survived. So they rounded up all the chickens, and the next day they took them to campus and processed them. How cruel, you survive the firestorm, and then they come in and they harvest it.
Any other questions?
You mentioned you mentioned possibly rerouting the railroad. Is that a serious consideration, and are other possible routes available?
There used to be a railroad right-of-way that went through the Swanton Valley. Still, the right-of-way, you can still find it, and it's closer to Swanton Road, and so it could be a starting point. There's a lot of land along Swanton Road from what we call the greenhouse, the ranch headquarters, all the way down by where the fire station is, that could be used so one of the questions the county will have is, that area is all zoned agriculture. So if we start putting railroad tracks down, how much ag land are we losing? So we would have to look at how we balance that. The only reason that we're even thinking about the potential of moving the track is 4 years ago, with the heavy storms, we lost part of the track. And in fact, it hasn't been repaired yet. We have FEMA money to repair it, but getting all the permits and getting the design work done and making sure that FEMA is behind us on it has been a painfully slow process. But there's several areas along the right-of-way that have very similar relationships with the creek, if you will. So the potential for the creek to overrun its banks and take out parts of our track is significant. Given the ecological significance of the creek, the permitting process to get in there and to sort of try to manage the creek in a way to protect the railroads, probably not practical. And so, again, looking at it from a sustainable standpoint, if we can move the track away from the creek, that would be a good thing. I'm just not sure that's possible. I'm not sure that the right areas are there. We have a lot. We have to consider a lot of things in terms of public access and other things. But it's worth exploring right now, because we don't have any other than the turntable. There's, what else is there that makes us stay in that location?
If anything else, guys, go ahead. Okay, well, let's see. Maybe we have
I had one more.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I was trying. Obviously I spoke earlier, but Charlie, part of like I haven't met you. I've been there to the ranch. I've been there on the railroad. I've fired one of the locomotives. One of my friends was one of the more active members. Come from Southern California. Been wanted to get more involved with the organization. Have myself as well as other members that are from Southern California have put forth and proposed solutions to the society. We have, our group is mechanically very resourceful. We have diesel type locomotives that we have built, and those locomotives were built with the intent to be able to be regauged to fit the 19-inch gauge of the railroad. There was offers to regauge the locomotives and provide a mechanical support for the railroad immediately, and these would be personally owned equipment. Not only that, but there had been personally owned equipment there on the property. How is Cal Poly, the ranch, the school side of it, in support of members wanting to help out the organization and are willing to bring their own personal assets to help out? How does the museum feel about that? I mean, not the museum, but the organization, the school.
University. Okay. Not the easiest question to answer in this venue, but let me take a run at it. We want the railroad. We want to have a plan forward on the railroad. We want to have a thoughtful plan forward. Right now,
high wind warning around Parlor.
Right now, there's a lot to be done just to preserve the railroad equipment that we need to focus on. We need to get that stuff secure and put away. We need to then decide how we're moving forward with this. And so at that point, once we have a plan forward, then we can start talking about how do we implement that plan. I can tell you the university will be supportive of the help as it's needed. But I can tell you also that this fire has brought into very sharp focus the fact that that any relationship with people bringing their equipment onto the site will be done through a contract. It won't be like we've done in the past where people just, I've got this piece of equipment, I bring it in, it's on the rent. Because people lost personal property on this fire. And there's issues of liability and other things that have to be addressed. And so the corporation has made it very clear that as we move forward, they'll want to be sure that anytime we have people bringing their personal equipment in, that it's done with at least some formal contract. Now, I'm not talking about really difficult, long legal documents. It's not different than if we go down to the local tool rental place and we rent a piece of equipment. There's an agreement that is there that spells out liability and other issues. And that's exactly the same in this case. We'll just need to be very deliberate about making sure that we know what's there and what the relationship is, and ultimately, if there's liability involved, who's going to be liable. I think what we forget is the universities keep talking. If there's an accident or something else on the ranch, and it's caused by someone's bringing a piece of equipment in that, for whatever reason, was defective, it's likely the university is going to be the one that pays out, not the individual. So the university is going to want to make sure that those issues are well addressed before they come in. So I expect we'll continue to have personal equipment on the ranch or on the railroad because it's just the nature of the game. But I also don't think that's going to happen, you know, in the next month or two. It's going to be months. I mean, we have no buildings. We have no place to park our equipment. We don't have track. We can't even get from the round table down to the train station because of the track damage. And people are asking, why aren't we fixing that? We aren't fixing that because we have very specific directives from the county that we're not to get in there and muck around in there until the cleanup is done and it's been certified. So that's what we're working through right now. They're doing the cleanup. Once that's done and the county signs off, then it's back to, okay, let's get going on this railroad. We are working around the edges. We're doing work in the shop. We're continuing to work on the 502, those sorts of things. But the county does not expect us to get in there and do, you know, to have major work days and other things until all of that site is deemed safe, cleaned up and deemed safe. And by the way, the university COVID rules are still in place. So we'll have to continue to work through this slowly. And I know it frustrates some people, particularly the ones that operated under Al Smith's rules. You know, I loved Al Smith, but boy, he, you know, the rules weren't, they weren't that important to him. I mean, you know, it was clear that if you have a major accident, you get one major accident, it's over. But you know, he was pretty loose in how he approached the operation of the railroad. And to his credit, it worked, and we have a railroad today because of that. So we need to honor that, but we need to, as we move forward, we need to do it in a deliberate way. So that was a long answer, but hopefully it answers your question. If not, tell me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I asked this because, you know, I'm a business. I've been there. I've done the New Year's events a couple times, and it's definitely an enjoyable place. You know, there's a great camaraderie. There's a great group of people. You know, especially the other site members, and I follow the Swanton Pacific, you know, Facebook page and their Twitter page, or their Instagram page, and so. You know, obviously, I you know, like to know what's going on with the, you know, constantly know what's going on with the organization of the railroad, you know, how things are progressing on the mechanics side. You know, geographically, I'm very far away. Makes it challenging to attend, like, you know, even like a monthly get-together. You know, I've, you know, tried to participate in some, you know, one's trying to participate in one of the week-longs is either conflicted with something else that I have plans, but obviously, I saw what Al Smith created, and I wanted to, you know, I'd like to support that, and I supported, you know, when there was an offer to you can pledge, pledge towards, you know, the recovery effort. You know, my wife and I both independently pledged for that and provided, and you know, we want to see the survivorship of the Swanton Pacific Railroad and the ranch. It's, you know, but also from a train enthusiast, and wanting to be involved, and, you know, that way I, you know, kind of pose these questions, you know, just to kind of get clarity on it, because obviously we've been.
And I agree. It's been a difficult time because, you know, we have not had the progress that we expected in terms of cleanup. And that's because the company that was contracted to do the cleanup was not doing it as we'd asked them to. And so we basically put the brakes on. The corporation stepped in and said, no, here are the standards. We've got to do these things. Because, again, I mentioned earlier that the cleanup of the facilities, anything we do to recover stuff inside the buildings, that's our ticket. We have to pay for that. The overall cleanup of the fire debris, that's the insurance company pays for that. So, you know, we've been working diligently to try to get this thing on the tracks, if you will, and to make sure we don't lose artifacts in the cleanup. That's taken us a lot longer than we anticipated, but it's necessary. I said earlier, this railroad wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the society. If the society hadn't been there to do all the work they've done over the decades that they've been involved, this railroad would not exist. This railroad moving forward will exist because of the society. So they will have to be involved in some way or another, because the college can't operate this railroad by themselves. That's just not practical, and it's not in their wheelhouse. And so, again, we all want to honor Al Smith's legacy, and there's two legacies. It's the ranch and the railroad, and so we're going to do what we can to make sure both of those are, we handle both. We handle this disaster and the set of opportunities it presents in a meaningful way, in a way that is appropriate to honor that legacy.
Okay, let me thank everybody for joining in, and particularly thank Charlie Crabb for a great presentation, which clearly generated a lot of interest and conversation. On the screen, you can see a couple of things, a place to donate to the museum if you're so inclined. The Parlor Car Chats page, if you're not familiar with it, is in the upper right-hand corner. That's where all the past recordings and future chats, information about them and how to join them and so on are put. There's a feedback link on that same page, and it's listed there too, that if you have comments about the chat program or have suggestions for topics you'd like to see covered, et cetera, whatever you want to say, that's the place to do it. And lastly, 2 weeks from today at the same time, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard, the topic will be views from the observation car, which is in essence a whole bunch of pictures that I took on my several opportunities to ride behind an Amtrak train on an observation car, or in some cases not more private train. So join us for that if that intrigues you. And in the meantime, stay safe, and we will see you then. Thanks for joining us today.
Yep, thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Charlie.
You bet.
You bet.